Hey, good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. I'm going to intro my guest better than this show just got introed. I'm really excited because we have Mark Hyman here. Your book, Washington Babylon, comes out today.
Absolutely.
And it's a history of American political scandals. I am 3/4 of the way through it. And I love having guests on the day their book comes out because I'm an author and I know how frustrating it is to break a book out. And I love even more being able to recommend a book. And I can absolutely recommend this book very heavily. Now, do you want to talk about what the book is, or do you want me to talk about what the book is? Guest choice.
I'll take a swing at that one.
Okay.
So Washington Babylon is a collection of nearly 130 scandals throughout 240 years of American history. We've got political, sex, bribery, political, military, sex, national security, sex. Well, if it wasn't for politics and sex, it'd be a much thinner book. But I do cover the whole genre. I've got media in there. I've got sports, entertainment. So I try to cover as many things as possible. And each scandal is handled briefly, 3 to 4 pages long. There's some that are 5 or 6, maybe 1 or 2. It's about 2 pages. But the whole idea is to give people a snapshot of scandals throughout American history. And all the ones that they're familiar with, they may not even know what they're about, but they've heard the names like Abscam and Teapot Dome and Watergate. But there are scandals in there that were the biggest stories of the day that have long since faded into obscurity. So these are stories that rocked the nation, as I say in my subtitle, but people don't know about anymore. It's amazing how many trials of the century there were over the last 200 years.
But it's also really fun reading it because how you write these vignettes is like, here's this person, they're a congressman, justice, something is something. This is what they did. Here's how they pretended that they didn't. And here's how we know that the actual truth was really, really bad and how they got exposed. And a lot of times it's almost like Tales from the Crypt or something where it's like they go to jail or they get away with it. And now they're in Congress.
And that's amazing, is that there are a few scandals that ended well, but most didn't. And it's usually the scandal when someone, if they're a political figure or an elected official, if they're running for office, the scandal usually sinks their campaign. But once they get in office, it didn't necessarily spell the end of their political life. Sometimes they weathered these scandals. And you mentioned, member of Congress as an example. There's some members of Congress I've profiled in this book that did some really nasty stuff, like kill people.
Yeah.
And they don't go to jail. They don't get kicked out of Congress. It's as if elected officials lived by a different set of rules than the rest of us back then, as they do today, by the way.
Yeah.
So it was fun writing this book. I know that sounds kind of strange to say I had fun writing about scandals and bad news, but I did. And I certainly hope the listeners will have as much fun reading it as I did writing it.
It was a lot of fun to read because one of the things I often talk about is how the elites are often not like bad people in the sense that like, all right, they'll take a bribe here or there. If that was the limit, we could wrap our heads around it. It's like levels of depravity that we don't even begin to wrap our head around. And the story I just read this morning, talking about members of Congress, tell the story of Alcee Hastings. This is a great one.
Well, Alcee Hastings is a great example of someone whose scandal ended okay because he was appointed by Jimmy Carter as a U.S. judge. And to make a long story short, he took a bribe and he got caught. And Alcee Hastings was impeached and removed as a federal judge by the United States Senate. They did everything they were supposed to do, except for one small detail. Normally, when the Senate impeaches a judge or another elected official, they also add into their written rules that person can no longer seek elected office. This was one of the few occasions where they forgot to do that, and they said they didn't say that Alcee Hastings could seek federal office. So nothing prevented him from doing that. So this guy who got impeached from South Florida, no longer a federal judge, said, what the heck? I'm going to run for the same body that impeached me, the House of Representatives. And he got elected. And he's had kind of the last laugh. And it hasn't even ended there because for years he's had his girlfriend on his payroll at the highest salary level. And there's been some certainly whisper campaign in Washington that she's kind of a no-show job anyway. And whether that's true or not, I don't know. I didn't address that in the book. But for him, all's well that ended well. He did okay.
Does it bother you when you hear people flapping their gums that think, oh, this is strictly a Democrat problem or strictly a Republican problem?
I told the publisher that there'll be a lot of folks who probably won't even want to talk to me because I don't hide the fact I'm a conservative. But when I wrote the book, I said, I'm just going to cover scandals that I think I would want to read about. And I didn't care if they had a D or an R after their name. So there are going to be some conservatives out there because I have Ronald Reagan in there. In fact, every president from Calvin Coolidge all the way up through Donald Trump are included in this book. And there'll be liberals out there who won't want to have me because I had Clinton and FDR and LBJ. And so perhaps I've offended everyone, but I think it's honest. I have purposely not counted up how many Republicans and Democrats there are, so I can't tell you which party is represented more than the other. I think it's kind of even, but I also like to point out, I have 15 American political parties throughout U.S. history included in this book. Even those straight arrow Federalists had scandals. Who knew? Everyone thought the Federalists were like pretty cool guys.
Well, no, gerrymandering was a function of the Federalists. Elbridge Gerry.
Federalists, the Whigs, the Know Nothing Party, the Free Soil Party. There are lots of parties in this book throughout American history, and they're included. And so I didn't really care what letter they had after the name. And when I wrote these scandals, and again, the political part, I think, is what is going to attract most people, although we have some sports scandals and media scandals and so forth. But when I wrote them, I sometimes included a scandal that after I wrote it and I had it in the book or in my manuscript, I went, I don't even like that the way that reads. And I pull it out and I throw something else in. It's totally gut instinct. There's no science to it. Maybe I was right, maybe I was wrong, but I just wrote things that I felt flowed in the book. And so I didn't really keep an eye out for the number of R's and D's there are, because I know there's someone out there is going to read the book and they're going to say, that party has two more than the other.
Well, there's also something else that I talk about that you address in this book, which is as soon as anyone in public discourse, you know how if you're having a movie and someone is getting secret messages from the television, right away you know this person is crazy, right? This is just a very easy shorthand for a writer. In political discourse, as soon as someone mentions the CIA, you know they're a crazy person, right? Even if you talk about MK Ultra, which the CIA has admitted to, you're still a crazy person. It's such a bizarre. And did you work for the CIA or FBI or both, right?
I worked in the intelligence community for 26 years. So I had assignments at NSA, CIA, DIA, and some other places. And I'd like to think it offers some credibility on my behalf. Yeah. And I'm agnostic to whether, why they did what they did. It's a scandal worth reporting. And there is a part of society that says, okay, these guys, they're there to defend our nation. They do no wrong. I'm also retired military. But I'm also the first guy that wants to hold military accountable when they do something wrong. I'm not going to assume that every man and woman who wore a uniform was perfect 100%. Sometimes there are bad people out there, even ones who wear dog tags. So it's the same thing. Yeah, I've got some, sadly, there are more CIA stories in there than perhaps I thought going into this process. But MK Ultra was a big one. Perhaps my single favorite story in the whole book was about Edwin Wilson, the guy that the CIA made a fall. They made him the fall guy when they got caught, essentially working against U.S. policy. Yeah,
let's do the Edmund Wilson story first, then we'll talk about MK Ultra, because that Edmund Wilson, like for those people who, there's this line about how a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged, but there's another line which is a liberal is a conservative who's been arrested. And Edmund Wilson is an example of you don't want the government, the Eye of Mordor, on you because it's not going to end well for you.
Edwin Wilson, this story really resonated with me for a lot of reasons out of the more than 200 that I looked at. And so Edwin Wilson from Idaho was kind of struggling to find his place in life, eventually got hired to work for the CIA in the very early days of the agency when it was all covert, when everybody was a secret employee. Eventually left the CIA and continued doing on his own what he had done for the CIA. For the CIA, he ran a front company. It was a merchant shipping company that was used to transport products, particularly including ammunition, weapon systems, and so forth, to various entities around the world, maybe certain governments, certain rebel groups, and so forth. Did this on behalf of the CIA. Left the CIA, eventually started a merchant shipping company, and was somewhat in the same line of work, to include was shipping arms to various groups around the world. He and his partner and one of the suppliers were arrested for smuggling arms to Libya, and he was charged and tried, and the CIA in a sworn statement, said that when he left their service, they had nothing to do with him after 1971. He was a ex-agent who'd gone rogue. Edwin Wilson was convicted, sentenced to prison, and spent 2 decades in prison. He eventually was able to prove his case. He filed a lot. When you're in solitary confinement for 10 years, you could file a lot of FOIAs.
So solitary, they put him.
His first 10 years, he was in solitary. Filed a number of FOIAs, cobbled together enough documents to show that he actually had been a contract employee for the CIA over 80 times. He was shipping weapons and arms to groups that publicly the U.S. said we don't like. Case in point, Libya. The U.S. declared Libya a state sponsor of terrorism in 1977. And Edwin Wilson was indicted in 1980 for shipping explosives to Libya. It turns out he actually was working for the CIA. He had been a contract employee for the CIA, but because the CIA was operating against our public policy, they made him the fall guy. They gave a sworn statement to the court that they had nothing to do with Edwin Wilson, when in fact they had. Eventually, Edwin Wilson was able to prove his case. A judge threw out his charges. At that point, he was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He was convicted in 4 separate trials. Proved his case. His charges were thrown out. He became a freed man. By this time, after over 20 years in prison, his wife had divorced him. The federal government seized all of his belongings. So he left prison alone and penniless and died.
And had no consequences, the CIA.
Well, he did try suing the CIA, the executive director of the CIA, who's the number 3 guy at the agency, as well as the federal prosecutors who were in on the lie. The judge who threw out the charges said the Department of Justice violated every ethical and legal line you could think of in terms of being complicit in convicting an innocent man because they were embarrassed, perhaps is maybe the best way you could describe it. He tried suing them. That lawsuit got thrown out by a judge who said, sorry, they have immunity. You can't. So Edwin Wilson, who served his nation, both as a CIA employee and as a contract agent, was made the fall guy because they didn't want to own up to the fact that whatever they were doing with Libya covertly was in contradiction to our public policy regarding that state. And Edwin Wilson, that case, and the interesting thing about that was I remember when Edwin Wilson was first charged in 1980. I remember that vividly. The rest of this didn't come out until around 2000, 20 years later. So this was one of those stories that I was able to kind of cobble together what transpired 2 decades later. And for some of the people I know of who I worked with in the past, all knew of the first part about Edwin Wilson. We all knew of him as the rogue agent. We didn't know how this thing played out 20 years later. He actually was serving his nation.
How does that make you feel as someone who swam in the same circles as him?
You know, you have to be skeptical in all walks of life, certainly. And I served in the intelligence community in a number of different places, and I've traveled abroad, and I've lived abroad. And one of the challenges, and I told folks that when I left the employment of the intelligence services, that one of the things I said that contributed to my reason leaving was a sense of arrogance.
Yeah.
Of the intelligence community who felt we're behind that locked door and no one's going to know what we're doing. And this speaks volumes for entities like an IG, an inspector general,
sure,
some internal auditor who has the wherewithal and enough resources that he or she can scrutinize what an organization is doing and hold them accountable, or at least if they start to exceed their authority, say, okay, folks, let's take a look at this. For the longest time, there was no real independent auditors. Those IGs, once upon a time, you had to report to the same boss of the agency that they work for. They've kind of changed some of that with the IG Act. But it's worthy of everyone to be skeptical and ask questions. And that should be the media. That should be bloggers. That should be activists. That should be public interest groups. And transparency is the most important thing we have all the time. The more things that are transparent, the easier it is to uncover misbehavior.
I hear you, but there's a difference between skepticism, and I don't think people appreciate how, I'm going to use this word, depraved you have to be to knowingly ruin a man's life when he was doing what you asked and go to court as a government employee and swear that he's lying. It's, we don't know anything about him. I mean, this is Soviet style stuff.
Well, the parallel to this was what went on with COINTELPRO, which was the whole FBI's counterintelligence program. Have you gotten to that part in the book yet?
No, I've not. That must be at the end.
Okay, so the FBI had this program that went on for decades, where essentially there were no laws, there were no constitutional protections. Every entity out there they thought was kind of a left-wing, left-leaning, subversive group.
Sure.
They felt there were no laws that held them back from what they could do, and they broke as many laws as possible. And when this whole thing blew up, one of the FBI agents made a reference to the fact that the Constitution was an obstacle to them doing their job.
Right.
It was silly these people had protections because they were the FBI. They had things they wanted to do. It's very similar. The FBI, for decades, had this massive program to go forward and violate the rights of lots of groups out there, and most of them, pretty much all of them, were left-leaning groups. Puerto Ricans, any kind of black group, black separatist groups, they all lumped them all together. They even considered Martin Luther King as a possible black separatist, which he never was. This is all through the 50s and 60s into the 70s. And then, of course, anti-war groups, the list goes on and on. They broke a lot of laws. In fact, that's how Bill Ayers, who was
The Weatherman.
from the Weatherman,
Yeah.
escaped prosecution because it was the realization that the COINTELPRO, and in his particular case, COINTELPRO, the FBI specifically violated Bill Ayers' rights as an individual. And so for someone who was on the FBI's most wanted list was actually spared any kind of prosecution because the FBI just ran rampant over civil rights.
There's so much content in this book. Can you give me one story that didn't make it?
I really wanted to get in the payola scandal.
Oh yeah.
The whole issue of record companies having to pay to have their songs played on the radio back in the 50s. That was such a significant part of what went on in the radio world.
Yeah.
And it has an impact today. But I couldn't get enough data that I thought I could put together a really strong story.
And it's not very Washington. But that was probably the first time that Americans realized how corrupt the media could be.
Yeah, and you do address, by the way, the whole issue of Washington. So my book, Washington Babylon, I try to have a Washington theme in every story. And I was mostly successful. There were a few you're going to read and go, Mark, that's a stretch. I didn't quite see the Washington influence, but I wanted to bring in sports and entertainment and so many other things. And many of these things, the payola scandal actually involved congressional hearings.
Oh, okay. Let's go back to the MK Ultra. A lot of people hear this term. Let's just the facts, ma'am. What was MK Ultra?
An MK Ultra, and that's a really challenging one because there has been so little written about it. So the CIA thought it was in competition with the Soviets and possibly the Chinese in order to develop mechanisms in order to essentially control people mentally.
Right.
And the problem with this whole program is that virtually all the records associated with it were destroyed at the direction of the director of the CIA. He said, look, this is back in the 70s, so this program had been going on for over 20 years. But he decided, look, we don't want this stuff to get out, so we're just going to destroy everything. And it was only a small amount of records that were mislabeled, misfiled, that showed up years later, and then were turned over to the intelligence committees of the Congress. And this was all during the Church Committee hearings, which was 1975, which looked at the abuses by U.S. intelligence and U.S. law enforcement over a series of decades. But MK Ultra was a program which the CIA funded a lot of experiments, which they kept covertly through dozens and dozens and dozens of entities, including colleges, including hospitals, people in the medical field. They didn't even know they were actually working on behalf of the CIA. And the whole idea of mind control seems kind of out there, some people are aware, but that was the experiment they were doing with. The things that were a little more easy to understand was the use of things like LSD. The very early days, the CIA was using LSD to see if they could kind of manipulate people. And there's a very famous case where a number of men who were working on this project were at essentially a dinner, a cocktail party, and one of them was actually drank his after-dinner aperitif laced with LSD just to see how he reacted. And he ended up jumping out of a hotel window and killing himself. And all of that was hushed up at the time. And these are folks that had no compunction about slipping drugs into other Americans' food or their drinks just to see how they responded. It was human experimentation is what it was. And so in the 1970s, when there was a bit of an uproar and an outcry about the way some law enforcement organizations and the intelligence communities were operating, remember, up until then, it was considered acceptable for the U.S. intelligence to assassinate foreign leaders. Our country decided in the 70s, we don't really go out and just routinely assassinate foreign leaders. There has to be some sort of compelling issue. And we don't allow U.S. intelligence communities to spy on Americans. It's all about foreign spying. So that was what transpired in the mid-'70s when there was this outcry. Richard Helms, who was director of the CIA, leading into this, said, you know what, let's destroy all these records. His official reason was, this program is over and done with. We don't need it anymore. We're going to destroy it. We don't have to keep these records around any longer. And pretty much everyone associated with the program had long since retired and gone away. What was interesting was the guy who signed the original memorandum to start the program over 20 years earlier was Richard Helms. So there's even a suggestion the reason why he had all the records destroyed was to cover his own tracks. Yeah. And that was only because of the good fortune that a couple boxes of records that were mislabeled, misfiled in a storeroom at the CIA were found and turned over to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, who went through it. And we learned more about MK Ultra than we ever knew before because everything was destroyed.
If it wasn't for their incompetence, if you'd said to me right now, if it wasn't for these mislabeled boxes, right, if a screw up, and you sat here 2019 and said the CIA used to give acid to people to try to control their minds, I would look at you like Alex Jones. But it's true.
It's true. And
documented.
And the CIA is admitted to it. And it's just, obviously, I was not exactly around in the 50s to talk about that climate, right. But certainly my dad, who was career military, was. And I remember as a young kid hiding under the desk doing air raid drills in Florida and all that. So there was a greater sense of fear that today's younger generation, millennials and Gen Xers, would never appreciate in terms of we feared that missile strike coming from the Soviet Union. And that was kind of the climate. And we viewed everybody with suspicion back in those days. That was the days, if you were a Soviet citizen, you couldn't just travel to the U.S. on a tourist visa. Very hard to get into this country and vice versa. An American couldn't go there. So it was a different climate, and it's a little harder for the younger folks to understand and appreciate it. But the notion of trampling on civil rights, and it was virgin territory. We didn't know, can you control someone's mind? At least that seems to be the experimentation they were doing. And it is stunning to read it. And I would love to be able to find some more documents one day. The CIA says they don't exist, but
who knows?
It would be fascinating. And the number of entities who were embroiled in this, colleges and hospitals and doctors and so forth and think tanks, had no idea they were part of this.
There's so much content in this book. Can you give me one story that didn't make it?
I want to get the television quiz show scandal involved in this. We've all grown up with television. We've watched all these game shows that have gone on for years and years, and we admire when someone runs the table in some particular show and sets a record for winnings. But back in the 50s, these shows were rigged.
Yes.
And they were rigged for ratings purposes, for advertisers and so forth. And this was a huge story of the day, and it shattered the illusions of a lot of Americans who admired certain winners of some of the biggest shows that are out there. This was kind of primetime viewing. People really were glued to it was appointment television to see these shows.
And I just read Larry Rivers' autobiography, the painter, and he was one of the people involved in this. And what he pointed out was it wasn't even that these winners, it was their fault. Like what happened to him, he was backstage for one of these shows, and the producer just happened to leave the questions on the table in front of him. He didn't ask for this. And he didn't know, is it plausible deniability? Is this an accident? Should I look? He did look, but at the same time, it's, they could both play dumb. So it wasn't even always as heavy-handed as people think, but it was extremely pervasive.
It appears to have been. And again, this was one of those that I didn't have enough material that I felt confident that I could tell that story. A very strong story at about 3 to 4, 5, 6 pages. I really wanted to get to the meat of it. And there just wasn't that, and I actually was kind of running out of time at this point, and I was, at some point you have to say we're done, and I'm turning this manuscript in, and I met my deadline with 24 hours to spare.
Nice.
I turned it in a day early, but if I'd had more opportunity, I would have loved to go back and look at that, because I think today's public would appreciate what was going on back in those days, that these things were rigged.
Yeah. Hey guys, Michael Malice here. This week we are brought to you by Wix.com, Wix.com. If you go to Wix.com/welcome, you can learn more. It's a better way to build websites for your clients. They've got the latest web technology and innovative design tools to deliver professional results. We've used it. If you go to LetThatBeYourWelcome.com, you can take a look. We put it together. You get a blank page. You pick the design you want. You can basically make your own web store or own website really, really easily. If you know how to use PowerPoint, you'll know how to use Wix. So you can have enterprise-grade security, automatic web hosting. You can make edits really quickly. You see a little typo, you want to move things around. It's really, really, really easy to do. And they've helped a lot of people grow their business with a custom online store. If you go to Wix.com, Wix.com/welcome, you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's get back to the show. Something else that I've been very hostile toward the Clintons for a very long time. I remember since college. And even I have forgotten the level of scandal that surrounded them. And I remember, and your book brought back the 90s in the sense of people on the right. It's kind of like with Trump today. Every week would be like, what is it now? And there would be this sense of shock that the press would basically cover for them things that were just ridiculous on its face. And the one example that I'd completely forgotten about was the wag the dog incident about impeachment, which is so much in terms of like things that are horrible, like, perjury, that's really bad. But the wag the dog incident, that to me is so many orders of magnitude worse.
When I was compiling my list, and I had maybe 220, 250 scandals, I initially compiled and I pulled out the priorities, which ones did I like, which ones I thought went well. It was kind of upsetting. I had so many associated with the Clintons.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to just go after the Clintons, but, and of course, I've lived through some of that.
Sure.
And let's be honest, there's so much more media available. You can document those stories in greater detail than you could.
You don't have that many about Obama. It's not a Democrat thing. And you don't have that many about Jimmy Carter or even LBJ, who was not exactly a nice person.
I think some people are just predisposed to behaving badly.
Yeah.
And that's the way they were. So in the case of Wag the Dog, people may not recall this, but in 1998, when the whole Monica Lewinsky story broke, and there was some back and forth, and Bill Clinton wagging his finger, looking at the camera, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And that was the storyline and the narrative. And for the most part, the media said, look, the guy's being honest.
And she's a stalker.
Oh, remember.
This chubby intern somehow can stalk the president.
She was 30 years younger than him, and she was made out to be the villain.
Yeah.
The most powerful man on the face of the planet was somehow the victim of a 25-year-old unemployed college graduate.
With Secret Service protection, but somehow she's stalking him. Yeah, okay, they used that word.
And so that was the whole climate back then. And then lo and behold, Monica Lewinsky says, oh, by the way, I have this dress that has some biological matter on it that proves my case.
Yeah.
And they took a DNA sample from President Clinton, and they compared it, and they found, yep, that was a semen stain on her dress. That was his DNA.
Do we know what sample they took? Was it his hair, or did he have to?
As I recall, they clipped his hair.
Okay, it was his hair. Okay, got it. Okay.
So in August of 1998, Bill Clinton finally had to testify in front of the grand jury, and so there was a lot of speculation about what he was going to say, what was going to come out of it, because at this point, and certainly now we know years afterwards, but he had committed perjury in an earlier deposition. He had suborned perjury. He had tried to convince both Betty Curry and Monica Lewinsky to lie to federal investigators and in their sworn testimony. So on the day that Bill Clinton was to testify in front of the grand jury, he ordered a missile strike on what the White House claimed was a chemical weapons factory outside of Khartoum in the Sudan.
Sudan, which is not a country we talk about often, which is
No.
not a big existential threat to America, and is not a country most people can find the map. It's by Ethiopia, for those who don't know.
And for anyone who wants, just read the book and read the details, because what it goes into is that this was the largest pharmaceutical factory in Northeast Africa.
Right.
And it was making drugs.
Medicine.
For people who need it in an area that was without. And it was wide open, and people came and went. There was no guards. If you're looking at it from satellite imagery, there were no guards. There were no sealed doors which you would need if you were producing some sort of chemical or biological poison. I mean, it's a very specific way these buildings are built if they're doing something nefarious to protect the workers themselves. None of that was happening. People came and went and so forth. Even the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't even know this missile strike was going down until just before it happened that day. So everything was kept in the dark. So Bill Clinton launched a missile strike against the Sudan over what the White House said was a chemical weapons factory associated with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had never been there. Right. None of that was true. And so this went on for a couple of weeks before the White House, after worldwide condemnation. Now, what I put in there are a lot of newspaper headlines from around the world. Not so much the U.S., because the U.S., the media was still kind of going light on this. Well, maybe Bubba's right. Maybe there's something going on there. But the rest of the world said, no way. No chemicals. This was a pharmaceutical factory producing medicine. But
also, the people who ran the factory said, if you called us, we'd give you a tour.
Absolutely. Come on in.
Please.
We're happy to show off what we had. And what's interesting, the sad part about this, even the missile strikes aside, was that how they wiped out the single biggest pharmaceutical factory in all of Northeast Africa. In a continent where medicine is often in short supply, in one of the most impoverished nations on the planet where they could use this. And the owner of the factory said, you could have come here anytime. In fact, at one point, they made offers, because there was some whisper campaigns. They made offers to the U.S., come and inspect our factory, to which the U.S. said no thanks. Launched a missile strike, and that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. As big as the Monica Lewinsky testimony was, Bill Clinton's testimony in that case, it was these huge missile strikes, and I referred to it as Wag the Dog because if you're not familiar, a movie premiered early in 1998 that was called Wag the Dog, and it was about a couple of a politician and a movie producer who were faking a war in another country in order to protect the president in this movie, who was in the midst of a sex scandal. Bill Clinton's life imitated art. But it just didn't end there either, because months later, when the impeachment vote was taking place, and I'll rephrase it, not the impeachment vote, Bill Clinton was already impeached by the House, but when the Senate was voting on whether to remove him, Bill Clinton ordered yet another missile strike against Iraq. And that missile strike went on for several days. And he said it was because of some statements made by Saddam Hussein only weeks earlier. Saddam Hussein made his statements almost 5 months earlier. It was just another way to use our resources and put our men and women in harm's way in order to cover up the news of the day, which wasn't particularly favorable towards Bill Clinton.
It's also, let's put the shoe on the other foot. Like Americans, we don't like to do that. But can we imagine if Sudan had shot missiles at like CVS? I mean, we would be wiping them off the map. I mean, it's an outrage that because we are so powerful, that basically they didn't even have consequences for this. This is just, I mean, it's horrifying.
It is. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners have traveled. I'm sure a number of your listeners are from not even this country. They've probably lived elsewhere.
Oh, no, only Americans on this show. I don't want any of those foreigners.
Okay. And it's perhaps easy for some people to turn a blind eye to launching cruise missiles, particularly cruise missiles that really had no relevance. The whole strike, there was no relevance. It should have never happened, but it was all for politics. And I'm in the news media today, and it's disconcerting that I have colleagues in this industry who will violate their personal views and their principles in order to further some political narrative. And I think that's what happened with the Wag the Dog narrative. And I remember that. Everyone remembers the film, which is why I call that section Wag the Dog. Bill Clinton's life imitated art.
There's so much content in this book. Can you give me one story that didn't make it?
So the story that I really want to put in there certainly involved a key figure in American politics that that frankly, it impacted me in a very important way, and that was the criminal activities of President Frank Underwood.
Oh, yeah.
And that his rise to power, particularly when he pushed that poor girl Zoe into the train.
What do you think of the documentary series? You think it was well done?
Well, I thought casting Jack Black in the role of President Underwood was probably not the best they could have done. I would have perhaps gone for another actor that might have captured that role a little more like RuPaul.
Yeah, but Jack Black, like Tom Hanks, right? Tom Hanks had the comedic background, right? And then he became a more serious actor. Were you not surprised that Jack Black could even bring that level of realism and drama to the role?
I will tell you, I got choked up in that one particular scene where he was making margaritas in the blender, and then he just kind of looked off into the distance, and he said, we should have soft serve ice cream in every home in America.
Yeah.
And to me, that was just an unbelievable moment. I was choked up. It took a while for me to compose myself when I watched that part of the documentary.
Let's talk about your dedication then, because I took a screen cap of this as I was reading. This raised my eyebrow. You dedicated this book to the men and women working in local newsrooms across the nation, and it's their tireless and dedicated work that has uncovered many of the biggest scandals. Why are they the dedicatees of the book?
I want to separate. Often when we talk about politics, people tend to think of the cable news world,
Yeah.
and the networks and the major newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, and so forth. And my reference were to those folks working in small town newspapers, mom and pop newsrooms of TV stations and radio stations around the country. I'm in the television business. That's what I do, my day job. And while there may be some newsrooms that skew a little left, some that skew a little right, and I've met thousands of people. In the local side, it's all about getting the news out. They just want to serve their communities well. And many of the scandals that I address in my book were initially broken by those folks. The people who get all the attention, certainly in the current era, are the folks who host a cable news program somewhere. And I don't have to mention any names. Your listeners know who they are. Your viewers know who they are. You'll watch somebody hosting a cable show goes, well, we just broke this story, and here's our exclusive investigation. A, you didn't break it. B, that's not an investigation.
Nor is it exclusive.
And that's not exclusive either. But that's kind of, and so that's kind of we hang our hat as viewers. We go, oh, these guys did such a great job. No, it was some guy working at the little Muskogee Daily Bugle who broke the story initially and did this tireless work. And I think they're kind of the unsung heroes. And I've had the good fortune in my business. I travel to a lot of these places, whether it's Jefferson City, Missouri, or El Paso, Texas, or Columbia, South Carolina, or Des Moines, Iowa. The list goes on. And most of these people are hardworking and dedicated, and they want to do the right thing. And I think they're kind of the unsung heroes. And they're the ones that, for most of these stories I did, they're the ones who uncovered most of them, not all of them, but most of them.
Let's talk about someone who is a sung hero, but you kind of out as a real villain. And maybe you wouldn't use this word, but I would use the word, if not sociopath, at least close to it. Mark Felt, Deep Throat.
Yeah, I'll tell you, when you develop principles and you stand on them, that's something to be admired. So Mark Felt, for the listeners, was essentially Deep Throat. He was the guy that was feeding Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein all the inside information on what was taking place with the Nixon White House regarding Watergate. And no one really knew who that source was until he outed himself several years ago before he died and said, look, I'm the guy that was feeding Woodward and Bernstein, and they acknowledged he was the guy. Before that, there was speculation on who it was, and there were even folks who thought perhaps it was just many people.
Composite,
they cobbled together and said it was one guy. So when the story kind of breaks and Felt says, I'm the guy, and he was essentially the number 2 guy at the FBI at the time, the first reaction is, well, he was doing the right thing because there was some misbehavior going
Patriotism.
on in the Nixon White House.
Yeah.
But it turns out, you scrub the entire issue, Mark Felt was just an angry, vindictive man, because when J. Edgar Hoover died, Mark thought he should be promoted to be the new director of the CIA, or the new director of the FBI, and it wasn't. In fact, Nixon brought in an outsider, someone who never worked in the agency, and Mark Felt, by all accounts, was furious over that. So it wasn't because he had any altruistic reasons he wanted to do the right thing. He just wanted to get back to Nixon. What was interesting about this whole business was Mark Felt eventually was tried and convicted of doing the same things he accused the Nixon White House of doing. He authorized illegal break-ins. He authorized FBI agents to do things that were in contravention of the law. And this is the way the story developed, how sad it was. Nixon had already resigned. He was gone from the White House. Mark Felt gets convicted of breaking federal laws, the deputy director of the CIA. And then when it came time for sentencing, who came out of seclusion to speak on his behalf? Richard Nixon. And I thought, if I was Mark Felt, I would have said, Mr. President, that is so gracious of you, but you know what? I'm the guy who turned you in. There's no way I can let you do that. He had no compulsion. No compunction of allowing Nixon to come in and testify in court and say, please don't send this man away.
Right.
He was a loyal, dedicated servant. And I looked at that and I go, we can all probably think of someone in our life who was almost like that, or maybe exactly like that. And you go, the guy's kind of a D-bag.
Yeah.
And that's the way I looked at it. And then Ronald Reagan gave a pardon to Mark Felt. So Mark Felt, if he had just did it because it was the right thing to do, I'd hail him as a hero. But maybe his actions were correct, but his motivations were wrong.
Right. This wasn't some kind of, I can't stand by and watch Richard Nixon step on the Constitution when you're doing the exact same thing later. Not before, later.
Yeah. And then he was just an angry man. And, I guess maybe the desire to be the next director of the CIA, the second director of all time, was so powerful. But he was not a hero in my book.
Let me ask you a question that wasn't in the book, but something that's bothered me for a long time that's related to Watergate. I'm sure you're familiar with G. Gordon Liddy. G. Gordon Liddy was one of the Watergate burglars.
Right.
He was, really like a hatchet man for the Republicans, by probably his own words. I mean, he's a real character. He later became a talk show host. And I read his autobiography, which is called Will. And at one point, he was very proud of himself because he was defying the Supreme Court and Congress and the executive branch. All three of them wanted him, and he was just giving them all the finger. And he called his buddy, this is per his words in his autobiography, at either the FBI or the CIA. I don't remember which one it was. And he says, look, I have a family. If you need to take me out, tell me what street corner to stand on, and I'll be there so you can put a bullet in me. But I don't want my family involved. And the guy says to him, it hasn't gotten to that point. Do you think he's telling the truth? Is there something to that kind of story?
I didn't read his biography, so I don't know. In fact, I didn't mention it in this book, although I do reference G. Gordon Liddy in his role in Watergate. But he is among the few people. Actually, I do mention in the book. He is among the few people in Watergate who actually came out okay.
Yeah,
it was Fred Thompson. It was G. Gordon Liddy. He got the radio show. At one point, I know he was making $10 million a year as a radio host. Not a bad gig for a guy who went to prison. Yeah, he may have embellished it. It might have been great. It might have been the narrative that he wants to forward. I give him credit. He served in the military. He was an FBI agent.
Does that sound plausible to you, though?
Maybe 10 years ago, I might have said no, but after I did more research on this, and I don't want to move this into the discussion of what's going on today, but I think it's fair to recognize there's a whole scrutiny of what's going on within the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, the deep state, if you want to call it that, the possible abuse of the FISA system, the misuse or the abuse. We'll see how that plays out. Supposedly the Inspector General's report for the whole FISA court business is due out any day now, so we'll know more. And I did say, when I told someone years ago, part of the reason why I left the intelligence community was because I thought there was a level of arrogance that we're untouchable. So I guess it really wouldn't surprise me if that was true, but certainly helped sell books, I guess, in his case.
Well, it was a minor thing, and it struck me because there's another story I heard, and this is used as an example. These are two I often bring out, and was used as an example to show how crazy, air quotes, Madeleine Albright was. And there was a story, she was talking to a journalist. This is 2004. And she says to the journalist, "Don't you think that Bush knows where bin Laden is, and if re-election is looking dicey, they're going to trot him out and get re-election that way?" And the journalist's like, "Oh, look how crazy paranoid Madeleine Albright is." And I go, wait a minute, she was Secretary of State. If there's someone who understands, how international diplomacy and the government works, she sure knows it a lot better than you and me.
Yeah,
And she was wrong, obviously.
I don't know.
But I don't think she was crazy.
The thinking inside the D.C. Beltway is a lot different than the rest of us. And I think they see conspiracies where they don't exist, and sometimes the events that take place,
right,
they studiously ignore. Politics drives so much of it. And it's really changed a lot. I kind of put a finger back maybe 25 years ago. When there used to be conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, there were folks in Congress that tended to fall along ideological lines and less on party lines. And now, for the most part, most of the conservatives or center-right people have R's after the name, and those who are center-left have D's. So that ideological divide is also a political divide, a party divide. And I see less bipartisanship today than there was when it was Robert Byrd, rather, who opposed the whole line item veto business, when certainly that was a Bill Clinton era legislation. And he said, look, it's up to us, Congress. We get to decide where money goes, not you guys in the executive branch. He was pursuing that disagreement with Clinton over an executive branch versus the legislative branch, not Democrat versus Republican, what have you. So I want to plug my book again because we've been talking about this, but I want to make sure people know it's available on Amazon and Books A Million and Barnes & Noble and Target. And I actually stopped in my own local Barnes & Noble last night. One of my children had texted me and said, "Hey, Dad, I looked it up online, and Barnes & Noble is already selling your book in the stores, even though today was the release date." So I stopped at my own Barnes & Noble, and I found it. It was in the current affairs section, but it was all the way in the back on the bottom shelf because it was in alphabetical order. That's the way it worked out. So I went to the manager and I said, "So how do I graduate from the JV team to the varsity team where it says new arrivals?"
Oh, you have to pay them.
Yeah, and she said, "Oh yeah, you got to pay.
You got to pay. Pay to play. It says payola.
It's slotting fees."
Yeah, of course.
She said, "Oh no."
Just like with the cereal.
Yep.
There's a reason that Quaker Oats is on the bottom shelf. And Kellogg's is
well,
high
that's
level.
Supermarkets, and that's illegal in most states, slotting fees, but they do it. She says, "Oh no, that's your publisher.
Of course.
You got to pay for that spot. You don't pay for it. You're going in the little kid seat.
Yeah.
You're going in the Thanksgiving little table." And so that's where my book is. So for anyone who goes to Barnes & Noble, you got to look for the current affairs. It's not going to be in the new arrivals.
We're going to have a link in the show notes page, so that's not going to be a problem.
Yeah. So, and of course, ordering it online, but certainly I think it's a fun read. You certainly seem to think so.
Well, I got more questions about it. That's why I want to ask you. So one of the things I just got into it with Chuck Todd on Twitter, where he's like, "Oh, the founding fathers saw how Trump talked, blah, 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 blah." Talk about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. I had thought this was something that came out years later. I didn't realize they were hitting him with it while he was alive.
Let's talk about media in general.
Okay, sure.
So we tend to think today, let's talk about newspapers. That's an easy visual. Newspapers are dying, but still good visual.
Sure.
Newspapers, the broadsheets, the big paper, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, your local paper, the Erie Times, wherever it is. And with all the news, it's fit to print. We see what's in there.
Are you on Team Helicopter?
I am not.
Okay.
But 2 centuries ago, there wasn't so much newspapers. They were often called pamphleteers. They published pamphlets. And oftentimes, politicians had somebody, their buddy, published a pamphlet. There was some sort of alignment. There weren't just tens, but there were dozens or even hundreds. Everybody was putting out a pamphlet. And pamphlets weren't the news. It's whatever rumor, innuendo. It doesn't make a difference. Everything went in there. And they used those pamphlets to bash everybody they could, political rivals, the other party, someone who opposed some program they were trying to put into place. And the history with Thomas Jefferson and the whole issue of Sally Hemings, who was a slave who worked for him, and there was certainly speculation in recent years that he may have fathered her children, and there's certainly some DNA evidence that A. Jefferson was the father of her children. They can't prove conclusively that it was Thomas Jefferson, but certainly there's a lot of relationships there. In fact, Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's first wife.
Yeah.
So, and that was an era where it was against the law for people for interracial marriages. It was understood that there were relationships that took place, there were offspring, but they kind of looked away. It was the polite thing to do, even those who were slave owners. But Thomas Jefferson had a supporter of sorts who was a pamphleteer, who was a big supporter of Thomas Jefferson, and thought because he was a supporter, Thomas Jefferson should repay the favor by appointing him as the postmaster of the U.S. Post Office in Richmond, Virginia. And Jefferson decided he didn't want to do that. So this pamphleteer went from supporter to a critic. And he's the one that opened up, that we know of, the first person to say, oh, by the way, that slave of his, Sally, he fathered all of her children. And so that was the rumor that went on for literally 200 years until DNA testing has gotten as close to proving that it can, as well as there were even, at the time, there were references that her children bore a striking resemblance to him. And she wasn't, even though we say she was a slave, she was only a quarter black. So she was a light-skinned black and was considered about it. In fact, her own children were listed in the census as white. They passed for white. So that small amount of the black genes wasn't apparent in terms of how they looked visually, and they lived their life as white men, which was important back in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So,
but the fact that he's putting in writing that it's not even tongue in cheek that her kids, quote, bear a striking resemblance to those of the president himself. It's the president. It's not, some rando, when he was governor of Virginia or something like that. And then his personal was this his personal writings when he called her a slut as common as the pavement?
That was what he published, and he referred to her offspring as a litter.
Yeah.
So for those people who say, come on, the atmosphere isn't as toxic in the old days as it is today. They're watching all of these Disney movies where everybody was walking around, the future princess here and the king there, and they're elegant. There were some pretty nasty people in those days, and they said things that were not acceptable back then, or in some cases actually were acceptable back then, but we don't accept today and how they behaved. That's kind of what the book is all about. It's the answer to all those people who say, oh, this has never happened before. We've never had this climate. Actually, that happened 23 times just in this century alone.
Here's the notorious story that everyone kind of knows about, but you get into, which is really fun, which is Sumner versus Brooks.
Yeah, so before we went live, we were talking a little bit about just attitudes and how there's some disagreements. And right now, there may be members of Congress who make veiled references to others, sometimes mention their names. But there was a time where members of Congress would draw their weapons on one another. Or if they thought it didn't rise to the level of drawing a weapon at each other, they would beat each other with a cane, which is what happened in Congress with a member of Congress, a member of the House, goes over and searches out a member of the Senate who he felt insulted his state and his cousin and beat him on the Senate floor unconscious and broke his cane. And by the way, he wasn't the only one. There were other canings that took place. This was like a pastime. It was like if the game of frisbee throw and catch is the fraternity intramural sports of college, that's what caning was in Congress. Like every so often, oh, there's going to be a caning on Thursday. Come on by. Watch Jones beat up Johnson. It just happened. But those aren't even the worst examples. We talked about it before we went on air. One of my favorites, for those people who believe there's no way they misbehaved like this 2 centuries ago, I bring up the case of Congressman Robert Potter.
Oh, yes. I just read that this morning. Yes.
From North Carolina. So Robert Potter, elected in 1832, gets reelected in 1834, and he was really jealous of his very attractive younger wife and was convinced that she was having affairs with other men. And one day, Robert Potter...
Wait, but here's the thing. The two men, he was convinced, one was 17 and one was 55.
And they both were her cousins.
Yeah.
So they were cousins who actually stopped by on Sunday afternoon to pay their respects. They used to stop by for a few minutes and say hello, and they go off and do their own thing. Not unusual. Both cousins of hers. It's kind of what people did. But Robert Potter had a jealous streak, and he was convinced they were having affairs with his wife. So he chased each man down, tied each one up, castrated them, tucked them into bed, and then told them not to mention they didn't have testicles, because that's really embarrassing for a man to admit, and then summoned the doctor. And here's, as shocking as that is, the U.S. House didn't think that was enough to expel him from the chamber. They kept him in the U.S. House. Now, he thought the proper thing to do, since he'd been charged with malicious wounding, was to at least resign his seat, which he did. But that's amazing, and that's just one of many examples. And he spent a little bit of time in jail. I think he spent 6 months. He eventually was charged and convicted. But there was Philemon Herbert, another congressman from California in 1856, having breakfast at the Willard Hotel in Washington, which still exists today, thought his breakfast wasn't being served fast enough. So he attacked his waiter. That fight didn't go well, so he drew his pistol and shot and killed him. And he was charged with murder and was acquitted because of the attitudes in 1856. Put aside slaves and blacks and all that, that was a different category. The worst people in America in 1856 were the Irish. Everyone hated the Irish. They thought they were the worst of the worst.
They were so much smart. We were so much smarter then.
And they were convinced that the juries, there's no way they're going to convict a member of Congress for shooting an Irishman. He was acquitted. He killed his waiter because he didn't get breakfast fast enough. I mean, usually you go to Yelp. You write a bad review. You know, I got my IHOP pancakes and I was missing
the review would be, I was served by an Irishman at this disgusting restaurant. You don't want to come here. They have Irishmen on the staff.
And that's one of the things I actually, that is always a revelation for a lot of folks. I go, for the longest time, again, the black-white thing, completely different, because you didn't even consider at that time in the early 19th century, mid-19th century, they really didn't even think about blacks in terms of equality.
Right.
And this. So who were the worst in America? The Irish. They were the worst, only to be replaced by the Italians, who were the worst after that.
Are you familiar with Thaddeus Russell and his book, A Renegade History of the United States?
I am not.
He talks about this, how for all intents and purposes, the Irish and then the Italians were regarded as black. They were not regarded as whites.
Correct. I have read other historical records on that. So the fact that you can, as a member of Congress, can shoot and kill your waiter because the breakfast didn't come fast enough, and the jury convicts you because the waiter was an Irishman. Now, maybe if he was a Scotsman, he might have been convicted. But what the heck? There was a guy who was an Irishman. And so, and I apologize. I know it sounds like we're making light of it, but I kind of want to underscore for people that the climate was different, and people misbehave, and there was a different set. It was a different view, a different set of glasses that we looked at things.
Well, it's not only the race thing; it's also there was still, I think, a lot of the remnant of the European social hierarchy. And this is a congressman, and you're a waiter. You might as well be a dog. So there's an element of that to that as well.
Landowners, versus tradesmen.
Yeah, right.
That was, in fact, that's how the political parties were divided back then. Landowners versus tradesmen. The political party, the Federalists were all the landowners, and they referred to them as Republicans, but they were Democrat Republicans. That was Jefferson's party, and they were essentially the tradesmen, the farmers and the tradesmen, the workers, the guys who got dirt under their fingernails. Right. That was them, and they tended to be more aligned with the French, and the Federalists were aligned more with the English, and it was just, that's the way
finance
things were.
And the hoity-toity, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Not the hoi polloi like you and me, who have to work for a living.
Oh, I've never had dirt under these nails. God forbid. Good Lord. I didn't get on a boat from Russia to come here and be filthy. We had plenty of that back in the motherland. Mark, we are running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
The fact that you've read my book. I have to tell you. So the book went on sale today, and I've had a few books for a couple of weeks, but I'm stunned at the number of people, close friends, who've said, well, I don't have to buy a book. You'll give it to me, right? and not a few. Or can I have a couple books? Like, dude, seriously? I have 3 kids in college. I need every nickel I can get.
Yeah.
The second part is the number of people who told me they had the book but hadn't read it yet. And I even had someone tell me that before the book even went to the printers, which was a great revelation when I told him I hadn't gone to the printers, and he said, "I'm busted, huh?" I go, "Yeah." The fact that you've read the book, obviously you got it early, and I appreciate that, and you know it. And I had a lot of fun writing it. I think if the viewers and the listeners have half as much fun reading it, half as much enjoyment, then they're going to really have fun. I mean, I wrote the book, but it isn't just a matter of writing and putting it in the shelves. I want people to read it. And I don't know if they're going to walk away a whole lot more enlightened than they were before. It might be simply the joy of saying, wow, there were some really bad dudes out there who did some really, really stupid stuff. But it was just enjoyable. And maybe it brings us a little back to the reality of that all bad things don't happen today. We don't have scandals only with Donald Trump. We don't have people speaking badly of others only from 1993 on. I mean, it's been 240 years of American history. And of course, I start off with the backstabbing that took place. My first story is about George Washington, who almost didn't finish the revolution as the commanding general of the Continental Army because there was a cabal of generals who thought he was unworthy. Remember, up until he encamped at Valley Forge in 1777, 1778 winter, he had lost every war, every battle he was in. So there were generals who wanted to depose him and replace him with General Horatio Gates. And Washington got wind of it, and it worked out okay. But there was some conniving going on. The father of our country was viewed with derision and disrespect by some of his own generals.
You are welcome.